Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. Honey, we got episodes and stuff. But another episode of our August Bible study. So, what does it look like to be somewhere between the shadow and the surely? David said it like this in Psalms 23, about verse number 4. He said, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He was hopeful for verse number 6. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. But how do we really navigate the space between the shadow and the surely? Well, in this week's episode, we are looking at our faith sibling Job. And if you know anything about Job, you know he has some space right there between the shadow and getting to the other side. So if you're like me, if you've ever experienced a bit of breakdown, you're trying to get to your breakthrough, go ahead, take a listen. Thank you for joining me. And so I'm going to go ahead and set the backdrop for you as we prepare to examine our faith sibling Job. But let me give this quick digression. Please pardon the extra that's been going on in my voice. I am personally relating to this study this week. I felt caught somewhere between the shadow and the surely this week as it relates to my health and just my body experiencing an opportunity to receive God's healing. We were somewhere between the shadow and the surely, right? So I'm glad to be back on the other side and moving closer to my breakthrough place. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and look at our faith sibling Job. So here is the backdrop. Job and his family are actually stationed in Uz. That's U-Z, not Oz. They're stationed in Uz. And this is what's interesting and why I highlighted for this particular study because us is associated with Edom, Edom. Now, Edom is right outside physically of Egypt, and we often know that in the Bible, Egypt represents like this place of captivity. It's stationed right between Egypt, but not quite in Israel. And Israel represents oftentimes God's city or moving towards the place of promise. So, tangibly, for this study this week, Job lives in Uz. Uz is a land that is not quite in Egypt, the place of captivity, but is definitely not in Israel, this place that is often associated with God's city. That's where his family lives. Now, in this place, though, Job is doing absolutely fantastically well. The Bible says that he has 7 sons and 3 daughters in biblical times. Having those 10 kids was like a huge deal. It was a huge blessing, a huge point of favor to have that many children. And then the Bible goes on to share about his possessions. I'm going to go over to the text in Job chapter 1 and just read you some of the specifics on things that Job owned. Like Job had 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen. This is back in biblical days, 500 female donkeys. And the Bible emphasizes female because female is often associated with multiplication potential and reproduction potential, and so it's letting us know with no uncertain terms that Job is a man who has been favored and blessed. He's a man of great wealth currently, and he also has the multiplication potential to have even more wealth. So he's just good. And then his sons and daughters, they have these rich family traditions. The Bible tells us in about verse number 4 that each of them would have an appointed day and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat with them, and all of the siblings would gather together and their children and their household. And get this, Job was such a righteous man. He's described as blameless and upright, one who feared God, that each time that his children would have these gatherings, Job would rise early in the morning, and he would offer burnt offerings to the Lord, to according to the number of them all, everybody who had attended, because he wanted to make sure that if they had done anything that have been considered a sin against God, that he had made retribution for that. So Job was just doing his thing, loving his family, being prosperous, increasing in this land of Uz, not quite in captivity, but not quite in the promised land either. And so as a whole other scene that's happening elsewhere, God is on his throne and the sons of God come before him and Satan is among them. Now, I really like this idea, even though the notion of it is not pleasant, just this awareness of it is empowering, because when they come, the Lord says to say, now, where are you coming from? Now, we know that God knows all things. He's omniscient. He often asks questions, rhetorical questions, or questions to cause the person or the being to think about what they're up to and what they're doing. So Satan has to acknowledge to the Lord that I've been roaming to and fro. Y'all get that? I've just been roaming to and fro. I've been watching and I've been looking, trying to seek and see who I can devour. And so the Lord says to Satan that, have you considered my servant Job? Now, y'all have to be honest, and I have to say this. You know what? I'm like, you know what? If Satan ever goes up there before the Lord and he says to the Lord, I've been roaming, looking to and fro, I don't really know if I want the Lord to suggest my name, right? Because the Lord is the one who brings Job up, and he says, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth. He is blameless and he is upright. He fears me and he shuns evil. So God is just bragging on his son. He's just bragging on his son. So I will say that I do hope that I'm a daughter that the Lord can brag on, right? So Satan pushes back though. He's like, what? Okay, so yeah, Job does. He fears you and he serves you. But God, is that not because you have put a hedge of protection all around him and his household, and you prosper him and you cause his possessions to increase? Like, he's not serving you for nothing. He's just serving you pretty much because you've handed him life on this golden platter. Like, he's really challenging God. And he actually says to God, if you remove your hand and you touch all that he has, he's going to curse you to your face. So Satan is that bold about what he thinks about Job, but the Lord is just as bold. He is not intimidated. And he says to him, behold, Satan, all that he has is under your power. Just don't lay a hand on his life. All that he has is under your power. Just don't lay a hand on his life. And Satan quickly left the presence of God. And y'all, the Bible doesn't even say, but we know what he was up to. We know that God just gave him free reign to touch Job's life. Just don't kill him. And he leaves God's presence. So we know where he's going. So that is the backdrop. And look at here. Job is just minding his own business. He has no idea that this is what is coming for him. So we're going to jump down then to Job chapter 1, verse number 13. And that will allow us to just begin to see how quickly Satan began to bombard Job's life. In verse number 13, it says that the messengers, there was a day of the party, and the sons and daughters were eating, and they were at the oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job, and he says, the oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them, when the Sabaeans, some enemies, raided them and took them away, and they have killed the servants with the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. So here comes that bad news, like just like that. But here's what's interesting. It says, and while he was speaking, that servant was speaking, another one came and said, fire fell from heaven, and it burned up the sheep and the servants, and it consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And before he could finish speaking, you guys, number 3 comes, and it says, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands. They raided the camels and they took them away. And yes, they killed the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Here are 3 different scenarios. We can surely say Job is experiencing a breakdown. You have killed the oxen and the donkeys and the servants. You've killed the sheep and the servants. And now we have had a raid, and you've taken the camels and the servants, and like just out of the blue, back to back, before he could even process it, before one could even finish speaking, the next one had come. Can you imagine the emotions and the anguish that may have begun to build up in Job's heart, and how his mind perhaps was beginning to process what in the world is going on? Perhaps he even had to get through a moment of feeling as if it was surreal and this couldn't even possibly be true. But something about the validity of the sources and the anxiety that they brought in their presentation let him know this is not a joke. This is not a joke. My life, like who has like a raid from one country, and then fire fall from heaven, and then a raid from another group of people, all in one day, back to back. And if that wasn't enough, verse number 18 says, and while he was still speaking, another one came. and probably gave him the blow that I would just imagine is the worst of all blows. It says, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house. And verse number 19 says, and suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness, and it struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they're all dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So Job has went from possession and servants to his children, every single one of them being dead, with one servant who has alone escaped to tell him. Would we not agree that Job has definitely now entered into the space where there's the valley of the shadow of death, where there is a valley of the shadow of death? Now, I'm going to go ahead and give us the end of the story. And if you're familiar with many biblical stories, then you already know the end of the thing. You know that Job is going to get all of his possessions back, you know, and more. That Job is going to be blessed with his children and all of that, that the Lord is going to multiply his years and multiply his increase, and he's going to get it all back. Job is not going to curse God and die. He's going to get to the surely goodness and mercy side of it. But in that in-between space, in just a few quick verses, we can pull some tangible nuggets to help us understand. But how did Job navigate productively that space between hearing all of the news about the loss of all that he held dear and getting to the other side where God redeemed him and gave it all back? Stay with me. We have a few quick nuggets to bless you. Let's go ahead and prepare to jump to chapter 1 of Job, verse number 20. Right therein lies some very key nuggets. So again, I'm going to encourage you to follow along real quickly, because right here in just a couple of verses, Job chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, we see some very significant nuggets that are so simple. And I want to be very honest, I'm glad that they're simple, because when you are emotionally and physically and mentally and even spiritually going through a very hard time, sometimes less is just more. Simple is just sanity. That's what's good. And so in verse number 20, it says, then Job arose, he tore his robe, and he shaved his head, and he fell to the ground, and he worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. And therein is where I will share just 3 very quick, tangible tips on how to navigate that space that we can all find ourselves in when we're somewhere between the shadow and the surely. So in verse number 20, it says, then Job arose, he tore his robe, and he shaved his head. And there's a semicolon there. Now, in grammatical structure, that semicolon means there's a pause. That's a complete thought. So let's look at that little piece as a complete thought. Then Job arose, he tore his robe, and he shaved his head. So Job gets the news, and he arose. His posture changes. He tore his robe, and he shaved his head. In biblical times, all of that was a sign of mourning. It was a sign of grieving. It was a sign of acknowledging a deep woe or a deep wound, a deep blow to the spirit. It was a way of saying, I'm saddened by this. I'm deeply moved by this. I want people to know that I'm not in this happy, wonderful space, but in fact, I am indicating that I am deeply grieved and sorrowful. So what I pull from that awareness, that a quick, tangible tip number 1, when we are navigating the space between our shadow and our surely, Job, our faith sibling, models the appropriateness, the space to, 1, Acknowledge the hard space. Acknowledge the hard place. Job does not pretend that his heart is not deeply saddened or grieved by the news that has occurred. Job is fully in all that he knows about God. He is still fully able to still say, but this thing right here, it breaks my heart. Let me remind you that the Bible itself describes him as blameless and upright before the Lord. So this is not a man who's out of good standing and good relationship with the Lord. He's in good, excellent standing with the Lord. And so his faith walk, his ability to commune with God is intact. None of that, however, exempts Job or even disqualifies Job or even lessens the faith of Job for Job to be able to say, but this right here, it wounds my heart. This right here, it has saddened me. This right here, causes me to be in grief. And I think that's important to recognize because sometimes we can believe that having tears in our eyes or being wounded is some type of shortcoming in us as believers as it relates to God, to have sometimes a bit of worry or concern about an issue, about a health issue or a child issue or a job situation or a financial situation. But Job acknowledges his hard place. Be free today, my friends, my brothers, my sisters, members of our DGO community. Be free today to understand that God is not intimidated or overwhelmed by you acknowledging a hard place in your life. Wherever that hard place is, He is so well able to handle it. In fact, the Bible says to us and encourages us by saying, "For we have not a high priest who is not touched," meaning Christ is our high priest. He intercedes for us at the right hand of the Father. He's moved and he's touched by the things that concern us. The Bible also encourages us by saying we can cast all of our cares upon him because he really does care. He acknowledges that we actually have some cares. So when we are trying to navigate that space between our shadow and our surely, be empowered, be released, be encouraged in knowing that you can acknowledge your hard place to God. God can. God can handle it. God does not need for us to pretend that all things are always well with us, but he is there and he cares about the situations that impacts our lives. So tip number 1, that tangible tip, is as our faith sibling Job did, acknowledge the hard place. Do that conversation with yourself and with God. He's well able to carry and help you navigate that space. Number 2, the next point, it says, and he fell to the ground and he worshiped. And he fell to the ground and he worshiped. What allowed his mind to posture itself in a place of worship in the midst of such devastating and tragic news? What allowed him to regroup himself and still worship God? Well, one, he did not have to go through the motions of pretending that his heart was not heavy. So he could bring that heavy heart, that mental anguish, that sadness in his emotions, even into his worship. He could come before God like that. And then in verse 21, he postured himself to allow God to be bigger than his circumstance. What do I mean by that? Because he says in verse number 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This was not about minimizing the loss of his possessions. This statement was not about minimizing the death of his servants, and it was definitely not about minimizing the lives of his children. He was not being callous or careless by saying, oh, the Lord gave and the Lord takes away. He wasn't being flippant at all. It was his way of acknowledging that at the end of the day, God is bigger than all of this. I have nothing without him. I am nothing without him. The Lord gives, the Lord takes, the Lord is in control is what he is saying there. And so my only option is to say, blessed be the name of the Lord. I'm not saying blessed is his circumstance. circumstance. I'm not saying blessed is this situation. I'm not minimizing my loss. I'm just simply saying that God is bigger than all of that, that God ultimately has the final say so, that I didn't have anything with him and I don't have anything without him. So I'm just acknowledging him for who he is. And I won't allow this circumstance that is breaking my heart. I won't allow this situation that is grieving my spirit to cause me to make God smaller. Now we have to get that, because people can use this text and cause offense very easily when people are in the midst of grief situations or mourning the loss of their loved ones, and they toss this out lightly, and it's almost as if people are not supposed to be moved or hurt. They're supposed to just get over it because the Lord gives, and the Lord. That is not what Job is saying. Job is just clearly clarifying for himself that I'm heavy, y'all. I've shaved my head and I've torn my robe and my heart is grieved. But tip number 2 is this: I am acknowledging my God space. See, I won't make it without it if I allow myself to dwell too deeply on how much this is messing me up. I won't survive it. So a part of my being able to navigate between my shadow and my surely is to choose to acknowledge that even in the midst of this, God is still my everything. And whatever he does, I'm not saying that it is always good and it always feels good. I am saying that he is good. I'm not saying that this always feels blessed. I am saying he is blessed. Blessed be his name. So he is choosing to access his God place, that place that where regardless of what is going on, he can see God, he can feel God, he can touch God. And so for each of us, I encourage us to really know what that space is. Oftentimes for me, when things feel really, really low, like one of my lowest emotional places was during the loss of my father, and trying to feel God and navigate this space where I've prayed for something and I've prayed this for other people and I've watched you answer, but I don't quite feel as if you answered for me like I desire that you answered. I had to, for me, get in a space where I could just hear the songs of Zion, where I would just play worship music that would begin to soothe my soul. I didn't even really feel like doing in-depth Bible studies. I certainly didn't want to be somewhere teaching. But for me to tap or to access my God space was to tap into music where I could just hear the words, where someone else was pretty much doing the work of worship, and where I could just lay in a God-saturated space. So that is tip number 2. Access your God space, whatever that space is that allows you to feel him when you don't even really understand him. It allows you to be touched by him when you don't even really have the strength to touch him back. It allows you to feel his presence when you don't have anything to bring into his presence. Begin to tap into that space, access that space. And if you can't find it, perhaps a part of that is tapping into people who can touch God for you and being okay with being carried for a moment into his presence when you can't carry yourself there. That's what Job did. Job fell to the ground, y'all, and he worshiped. It didn't say he made it into the sanctuary. It didn't say he got somewhere on an altar. It didn't say he entered into his early devotional time. It said first Job acknowledged his hard place, and then number 2, he accessed his God space. He fell to the ground right where he was. He came just as he was, and he worshiped God. Now, his worship did not look like, in this particular passage, singing these melodious songs of worship. His worship really looks like just coming to God and acknowledging that, look, I'm nothing without you. I cannot make it without you. So in the midst of all of this, where it looks like things are being taken and given and all of that, I remember that I was naked anyway. that I came naked and I'll go naked, that everything I have is because you gave it to me. So I'm just going to say, blessed is your name. I'm not going to pretend that this scenario is good. I'm not going to pretend that this situation feels good. I'm just going to acknowledge that you're good. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Tip number 2, access your God space. And then I'll end with this one. Tip number 3. I love this. In verse number 22, it says, in all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. And so I'll just give a little snippet of the story later on as it unfolds. We know that we have friends who come before Job and they make all types of accusations about Job. The wife makes all types of accusations about God. And between the two different groups, you would either make Job guilty for doing something or make God just altogether worthy of being cursed and dying, right? Job in verse number 22 says, in all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. So my tip number 3 is avoid the blame game. Avoid either trying to make God guilty or even yourself guilty as you navigate the space between the shadow and the surely. See, in biblical times especially, people would always want to ask, so who committed these sins that would cause these circumstances? But we know the backdrop of this story. It was due to no sin. God was not angered against Job for some sin. And God wasn't just going around punishing folk and picked Job. It is literally this. As I said earlier, Satan was roaming to and fro. He just wanted to cause chaos in somebody's life. That's all that it was. For certain things that we sometimes face, it is not because there's some guilt against you. There's some sin against you. There's some allegation against you, and God is punishing you. Now, I want to be clear. I know that that does exist, but in the backdrop of this story, true to this text, that is not the case at all. And you guys, in honesty, I can remember, for lack of a better word, I guess I would say conversations where I've had people try to explain different things that are happening in my life and associate it with something like that. And I can remember thinking, if you only knew, because I was in tune with what God was doing in my life. And I knew that certain situations were not as consequences to certain things, but that God had made certain promises for me. And I was holding on and holding out for those promises. So I can identify with Job sitting in the midst of conversations and having friends or people who some had good intentions, some did not, who were trying to advise him on how to navigate this space, but they were associating it with negative consequences for choices or behaviors. Tip number 3, avoid the blame game. Avoid blaming God or blaming yourself for some great injustice or something that you've done that has now become an open door for certain things to happen in your life. From this faith sibling Job, we clearly understand that it was not due to that. Who sinned? Who's being punished in your circumstance? Nobody. Perhaps this really is in its oxymoron type of way. For certain things, this space where God has allowed certain things to happen, more so because he knows what the end will be. He knows how he will bless you. He knows that in the end, the retribution that he will bring for Job will cause nations to look at Job and want to know more about this God that he's serving. Perhaps the delay in having a child, the delay in being married, the layoff, the less than productive startup company that you're working in, the proceeds or the increase being a little delayed or slow, perhaps the struggle in the relationship or the temporary separation in the relationship, or the crying out for a child who hasn't come yet, or the crying out for a child who's in this situation. just the low ends of some of our journey. It is not because of a consequence. The navigation through a sickness in the body, the tending to of an elderly parent who may be struggling with dementia or some other health issue, and you're still waiting on God to bring that resolution. That struggle is not because of a consequence, but yet it is because God is going to show himself mighty and show himself strong. He already knew what he would do for Job in the end. He knew that the positions and the increase and the children were going to be there and that it would be multiplied more than he had ever lost. God knew. But the journey was there for his glory and for his name's sake. So I would encourage you to avoid the blame game. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, not going to belabor those points any longer. I want to remind us that as we navigate the space between the shadow and the surely, that we tap into what our faith sibling Job did. Job, number one, he acknowledged the hard place. Number two, he accessed his God space. And number three, he avoided the blame game. He did not sin and he did not charge God with wrong. May you be encouraged in your journey. May you continue to press forward. As a reminder, I always say, I honor the greatness that's in you because there is greatness in each of us. And the journey can look like what it looks like, but don't allow that journey to cause you to not see that God is up to something great in your life. Again, I want to thank you for being a part of the GGL community, for following and finding the content that we offer very valuable. If this video, again, has blessed you and you have not done so already, please remember to subscribe. And as always, share with others. I thank you for joining me. I look forward to having you joining me again next week as we examine another faith sibling as part of our study on what does it look like to be somewhere between the shadow and the surely. God bless you. I know that we'll see each other on the other side. Take care. Have a fantastic rest of the week.